The National Guard of the Republic of Latvia is a volunteer military formation charged with the protection of society. The goal of the National Guard is to involve citizens of the Republic of Latvia in protecting the territory of the state and its inhabitants. The National Guard is part of the National Armed Forces and participates in the planning of the country's defense system and in the carrying out of defense tasks as directed by the Defense Plan. When beginning service in the National Guard, new guardsmen take an oath.
Es Latvijas Republikas Zemessardzes svēru,
netaupot savus spēkus un dzīvību, aizsargāt latviešu tautu un Latvijas valsti, tās neatkarību. Apsolos pēc labākās sirdsapziņas pildīt zemesarga pienākumus. Stingri ievērot Latvijas Republikas likumus, Zemessardzes dienesta nolikumu un reglamentus.
Organized defense of the Latvian people began in 1918, one day before the independent Latvian state was proclaimed on November 17, 1918. The Latvian People's Council adopted a political platform. In paragraph 4, the platform called for the establishment of a draft-based military force, one which would also take volunteers. The acting government issued a statement saying, "Citizens of Latvia, there is no returning now. The acting government, which has been placed at the head of the people, calls you to arms." The armed force was made up of the first drafted and volunteered soldiers. It was constituted on December 7th and was called the National Guard. It included 18 Latvian and 7 German companies. During the Latvian battle for freedom, the National Guard was transformed into the Latvian National Army. It survived until 1940. "50 years of Soviet military occupation snuffed out the army, but not the fighting spirit of the people. That this spirit never died was proven in January 1991, when the imperialist forces tried to crush the people's will for freedom. People stood shoulder to shoulder to protect the most important objects of the newly liberated state. Barricades were built using everything that was at hand. Automobiles, trucks, and tractors were used to blockade roads and bridges leading to the capital city and to the seat of government. And the blockades involved people too. They came with their bare hands and with the ironclad conviction that any force could be opposed because on their side there was the force of freedom. We defended our freedom in 1991. The imperialists tried to scare us away by sending special units to occupy the Interior Ministry. Perhaps it was an attempt to provoke us into hasty action because 2 of Latvia's most famous television cameramen were shot and killed. It was a twist of fate that a Soviet cameraman was injured too, but the people survived, and the hatred of the occupant grew greater and greater. We believe now that it was in these turbulent days of January that the people strengthened their will to regain freedom. In August, the imperialist forces tried to crush democracy, not just in the Baltic republics, but throughout the Soviet Union. Individual segments of the Soviet army loyal to the communist regime tried to impose order. We had no armed forces of our own. This time our fate was dependent on events in other countries. We could only watch with hatred and anger at the actions of the alien soldiers at their red-starred armored vehicles. We watched as the reactionaries shut down our bastions of freedom, the television and radio stations. We were forced to watch as the police school at Kauguri was demolished. We were forced to suffer the violence and the looting of the Soviet forces. And at last we understood that a people without its own military force is a people forced to suffer and to survive. Because the barricades of January could not withhold the events of August.
Noteikta Latvija ir neatkarīga demokrātiska republika.
As soon as the Republic of Latvia was proclaimed in the wake of the Soviet coup, the law on the National Guard was adopted, and on August 24th, the registration of Guardsmen began. The National Guard accepts citizens of the Republic of Latvia who are at least 18 and who wish to serve. The Guard does not take persons who have been convicted of intentional crimes, who are registered narcotics users, or who have been declared incompetent. Within a brief 2 years, the number of Guardsmen reached 17,000. Only 7% of these receive a salary, the rest volunteer in their free time. The National Guard demonstrated its abilities for the first time in January 1992 when it undertook protection of the Latvian border. The Border Guard Force had not yet been established, and so nearly all of the National Guard battalions which had been established up to that time spent the months from January to June living on the border, proving that the boundary was real and that it could not be violated. Many a woods-beat tradesman trying to take away anything that moved and sell it off abroad found this to be true. The National Guard were the first to set up stationary and mobile posts on the border. There were 85 such posts along Latvia's boundaries at the height of the process in May of 1992. The dishonest tradesmen feel that everything can be bought and sold, and so there were attempts to bribe guardsmen, but that didn't work. Neither was there any success for people trying to cross the border with guns, with other types of weapons, or with other types of contraband. In the summer of 1992, protection of the border was taken over by the state's newly formed Border Guard Brigade. Even today, however, the National Guard participates in the monitoring of imported goods, along with the Border Guard, the Customs Service, and the police. The naval base at Liepāja. At one time, this was the greatest and most influential Baltic Sea base in the Soviet Union, and then later in the Navy of the Russian Federation. It was the largest occupation object in Latvia. One of the National Guard's most successful operations was waged here. Early in the second period of Latvian independence, Russian military personnel refused to obey the requests of Latvia's customs officials. So in April 1992, the National Guard blockaded the Liepāja port. We proved that we would not permit the theft of items and equipment located at the military facilities, nor would we permit the illegal and uncontrolled transport of contraband in Russian military vehicles. Of course, the Russians didn't like this control because to a great extent we managed to scuttle their plans. In May 1992, the Russians planned to deploy another contingent of soldiers at Dobele. The National Guard, acting on a request from the local government, blocked off several roads and, ignoring threats by Russian army hotheads, conducted careful searches of Russian military vehicles, turning back any that were carrying soldiers. Control of the movement and operations of the Russian military fleet of vehicles was conducted throughout the time when the Russian army was present in Latvia. At first, the military men had trouble adjusting to the lawful searches conducted by the Guard, but in the end, they had to give in. They had to understand that they were not the owners of the land, that they must obey the laws set out by the government with respect to military movements. In some cases, in order to avoid misunderstandings, the National Guard accompanied military transports all the way to where they were going. At other times, National Guardsmen stopped military vehicles which, contrary to agreements reached between Latvia and Russia, were attempting to move without control and fully armed.
Yeah.
National Guard patrols frequently had to stop Russian soldiers who had unlawfully left their bases and turn them over to their headquarters. More than once, such individuals had violated one or more Latvian laws. There were also incidents when soldiers were found to be in Latvia illegally. This too was contrary to signed agreements, and they, like Russian Marines before them, were unceremoniously ejected from Latvia in a procedure which did them no honor. One of the tasks of the National Guard is to prepare Guard units for battle and mobilization. This involves both juridical and military training in National Guard procedure. Training began almost immediately after the establishment of the National Guard. After many years, men again took up arms and stood in formation. Many remembered lessons they had learned in the Army long, long ago, and perhaps that is why the first steps in training were sometimes a bit awkward. The National Guard devotes much attention to the physical preparedness of its members. A soldier, after all, must be ready to overcome any difficulty. The first training instructors used knowledge gained in the Soviet armed forces, which was not necessarily applicable in Latvia. The experience of NATO countries was studied, and in September 1992, a program to organize National Guard training was begun. A group of infantry instructors from Great Britain arrived at a training center in Cēsis. Guardsmen were trained according to the demands of the British armed forces. For more than 2 years, guardsmen have been learning British infantry tactics. British officers have prepared the training programs. Several brochures on infantry tactics have been translated into Latvian and published. These are used in training in all units of the National Guard. At the Cēsis Center, National Guard instructors are also trained. Officer training takes place at the National Guard Department of the Latvian National Defense Academy. There is a special training center at Ogre. National Guard communications specialists are trained there. But all units of the National Guard undergo intensive training to instruct them in the knowledge which an infantryman must have. The Guard is always looking for other cooperation opportunities with foreign military specialists.
Through the enemy position.
Tas līdz pat vienādīgi pozīcijā, ja?
On guard.
Un iziet cauri vienādīgi pozīcijā, ja?
I am not going to demonstrate floating down the river.
Es nedemonstrēšu peldēšanu lejuplaupī.
But I'm sure you understand how to do it.
Bet es domāju, ka jūs saprotat, kā to darīt, ja?
Esi otrais, ja?
National Guard training also involves aviation. The National Guard aviation program is based on airplanes inherited from a Soviet-era organization. The planes are kept throughout Latvia, ensuring rapid flight time to any location in the country. National Guard aviation specialists are also helping to train parachutists. They must be prepared to quickly arrive at and dig into any location in Latvia, if necessary.
Zobens uz uzvaru trauc, pāri ciemiem un austrumu sāģām, karoks sarkam valsts cīņā mūs sauc. Pāri ciemiem un austrumu sāģām, karoks sarkam valsts cīņā mūs sauc.
Meklēt un atrast, un raksts ārā un krāmēt.
Every year, hundreds of unexploded bombs, mines, and other explosives left over from World War I and World War II are discovered buried in Latvian soil. There are explosives expert groups in every larger National Guard unit, and these men must work with this dangerous problem nearly every day. The difficult and hazardous job of finding and neutralizing these deadly items goes on so that one day the land might be free of them. We appreciate these men. As the saying goes, a bomb expert makes only one mistake. The National Guard can also rapidly be mobilized to assist in natural disasters. During desperately dry summers in the last few years, forest fires threatened large tracts of Latvia's beautiful and valuable forests. The National Guard was quick to organize in firefighting groups, using simple and available resources to fight the blaze. The National Guard cooperates with police and the security service to maintain order in large-scale events, especially when high officials from other countries visit Latvia. The job of making sure that such events go well is difficult and demanding. Given the terrible crime situation in Latvia, the National Guard often helps to carry out police functions as well. National Guardsmen have over the months arrested individuals being sought by the police: thieves, armed robbers, extortionists, murderers, rapists, drug peddlers, unlawful weapons carriers, individuals who are in Latvia illegally, and many other types of lawbreaker. Both in cities and in rural regions, there are regular National Guard patrols, and mobile units are available to help any resident who so requests. This is particularly often the case in rural areas where guardsmen are summoned frequently. That's because police often have trouble measuring the long distances of rural areas, but a guardsman is always somewhere nearby. The Guard was especially active during the time when thieves ransacked Latvia in the search for ferrous metals. Even gravestones were desecrated in this feverish campaign. But not all of the thieves went unpunished. Metal thieves surprised by the National Guard always ended up before the court. The National Guard has increased patrols in areas of especially high crime, and the results are frequently visible for all to see. One of the most profitable forms of illicit business in Latvia is illegal trade in alcohol. Often bottles are not accompanied with the proper documents, or else the documents are fake. The National Guard works with the police to monitor places where goods are sold. Sometimes the guardsmen uncover contraband barrels of spirits which are meant for distribution to underground stills. There, illicit brewers make products meant to confuse buyers who are seeking legal alcohol. The law on the National Guard provides that guardsmen participate in maintaining the lawful order of the state as provided by law. The National Guard helps people, institutions, businesses, and organizations to exercise their rights and to fulfill their obligations. There is a youth corps attached to National Guard units. It involves young people from 12 to 18 who can enlist only if their parents approve. The Youth Corps has a special training program involving elements of culture, tourism, sport, and military training. About 2 times a year during school holidays, there are National Youth Corps camps, where the young people put their knowledge to the test under the supervision of National Guardsmen. Each summer, there is also a Youth Corps event which gathers the best and the brightest of the Corps. Here they compete in various athletic events and contests on Latvian history and geography.
Liela ir tā tauta, kura godina savus kritušos. Paldies viņu mātēm un tēviem, ka viņi ir izaudzinājuši tādus Latviju dēlus. Nolieksim galvas viņu priekšā.
Beginning this year, Latvians can fulfill their mandatory state service obligation in the National Guard. Many of the young men who do so say they'll stay with the Guard even when service is no longer mandatory.
Tad, kad Dievas ziedos plauks, ja nenošaus.